record button because I always forget to do that. All right, we're good. You guys all ready to go? Yes, I see thumbs up. Thank you. Very good. All right, so today we are going to be talking about an issue.
Hey, Chris, Chris,
Uh-huh.
can I just want to loop them in on kind of why we're doing this and things? Can I
Please,
just?
yes, go ahead. Hi, Marissa. I see you've got a few more people in there with you. Okay,
Okay, I'm done.
thank you.
Sorry, all the echo.
All right. So I did, she muted you got herself, so I didn't hear what she said. Hopefully I won't repeat too much here. Just quickly, this is an optional webinar that kind of goes along with the Service Enterprise Initiative that you guys are participating in right now. And the reason why we're doing a webinar on this topic is because no matter what shelter we work with, when we talk about, the top issues and challenges, getting staff on board with volunteer programs is always at the top of the list. And I have a lot of times executive directors will say, "Will you please come to my shelter and make my staff be nice to volunteers?" And it's like, yeah, that's not how it works. There's a lot more to it than that. So we're going to be talking about sort of the other aspects of this and what needs to be in place. My name, as you can see on the slide, is Chris Bortz. I have been working for Best Friends for about 10 years, and I live in Kanab, Utah, where our sanctuary is located. It's supposed to snow a little later today, so I'm kind of excited about that. I'm from Southern California originally, so the snow still excites me. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Um, when we talk about bringing volunteers on board and helping our staff be more engaged with them, we're not doing this just because volunteers are nice to have. We're doing this because we are constantly in shelters needing to increase our capacity, right? You have a certain number of people, you've got your staff, and you have this mountain you need to move. Every day you come in and you push hard against this mountain. um, what you find is that you really could benefit from having more people, because guess what? That mountain just seems to keep getting bigger, doesn't it? Like every day you come in and there's more that you're expected to do. And there's only so big a mountain that you can move with a certain number of people. And what I hear over and over again, that's everybody's reality, is we don't have it in the budget to hire more staff. It's not going to happen. So how are you going to get the extra people so that you can move that mountain that keeps getting bigger? Well, you're going to do that through volunteers. Okay, so it's not just a nice thing to have. It's really to the point where, with the demands that are being made on shelters and what you guys are trying to accomplish, you need those extra hands. You need those extra people to help you do that. I talked with an executive director once who was telling me how when he started working at this particular shelter, this is located in Central California area, their save rate was about 30%. And over a few years, he got that save rate up to 70%. And he was aiming for that 90%, right? That critical number that is the baseline for achieving no kill status. And he realized that he knew what programs he needed to implement, what he needed to do to make that happen. But he also knew he'd never have the budget to be able to hire the staff to make that happen. And he said, right now our volunteer program is off to the side. Like we've got the shelter, everything going on at the shelter, and the volunteer program is sort of off to the side. And every now and then they throw a volunteer in to do this or to do that. He said, I realize that we need to move that volunteer program. We need to bring it in closer to what we're doing with the shelter. And he had started doing that. He had started moving that volunteer program in. And what he was aiming for, what he realized he needed, was a volunteer program that wasn't off to the side somewhere, but literally at the center of everything that they were doing and wanting to do, so that that volunteer program could feed out to all these critical things that were going on at their shelter. And I just thought that his visual for this really summed it up well. This is kind of where ideally we want to end up. So I want to know, if your particular case at your location, if you were to rate sort of the quality of your staff volunteer interactions and relationships on this scale, with 1 being pretty awful and 5 being pretty awesome, where would you say you guys are at today? And remember to unmute yourself if you're muted. I can hear the laughter, but I didn't hear the comment.
4-3-2.
4-3-2. And I know this depends on the staff person. It depends on the volunteer, and it even depends on the particular day, right? This can shift. Marissa, how about you guys?
We went with about a 3.5.
A 3.5. Okay. So you guys, let's just say you're somewhere in the middle, which is good. I mean, we've worked with shelters that are down here. Yesterday, we had a phone call with a shelter where they said, we're trying to get the staff to quit cursing at the volunteers. It's like, well, yeah, that's a good goal to set. That's a good place to start. So if you aren't cursing at volunteers, you're already ahead of the game. So being somewhere in the middle there is pretty good. Now, what we ideally would like to have is staff that knows how to effectively engage volunteers. That means they know not to curse at them. They are able and willing and understand the importance of talking with the volunteers, being friendly with the volunteers. They know how to give the volunteers guidance and structure and feedback. They know how to train the volunteers when that needs to happen. We also want staff to see that potential impact, understand why we want that volunteer program to move to the center of our operations so they can help us move that ever-growing mountain. And we want staff that has the attitude that the volunteers are part of the team. It's not an us and a them, but rather everyone working together toward the same goals. If you're not there yet, if these things are not happening yet, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to get there. So if you're not there, like, what's in your way? Why is that not happening today? And again, having worked with lots of different shelters, what I find is that there's some pretty common roadblocks that happen regardless of what shelter we're working with. first thing I want to ask, and you don't need to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate you, is how invested is your leadership in supporting and growing the volunteer program, right? If this is not a priority for your leadership, if it's not on their radar, then you can make improvements to your volunteer program, but you're going to be kind of pulling dead weight along the way. You really need your leadership to set the example and to really make a sort of a cultural shift where volunteers is really an important part of the culture of your organization. It's not, again, it's not just something that's off here, off to the side somewhere, but it's really part of the heart and soul of your organization and what you do. So how does leadership help to make that happen? Well, the first thing is they need to lead by example. And what that looks like is that they talk about volunteers, not just maybe once a year or twice a year, but that it's an ongoing topic of discussion throughout the year. We also want our leadership to talk to volunteers, okay? Can they walk the walk? They're asking their staff to engage with volunteers, to talk to volunteers, to say good morning and thank you, and ask them how they're doing on a given day. And is your leadership modeling that behavior? I think one of the critical things in being a good leader is that you model the behavior you ask of the rest of your team. Do they have their own volunteer projects? It's one thing for them to say to you, you need to come up with volunteer projects. You need to come up with things for volunteers to do. But are they doing it too? Are they setting that example? And if they're telling you that it's important to effectively engage volunteers, are they doing anything? Are they actually paying attention and seeing who is doing that? Who is doing a really good job of that? When we talk about recognizing staff who engage volunteers effectively, there have been a variety of different ways that we have seen this done. At the sanctuary where I work, we have these little kudo cards, and volunteers can fill them out and say, you know, I worked with staff person so and so today, and here's why this, you know, this was a really great experience for me. And those kudo cards are actually distributed to the managers of the employees, the specific employees, so the managers know who's doing a really good job of engaging volunteers, and then they're given out from the managers to the staff people. A lot of the staff post these like all over their work areas, and there's some sort of like friendly competition in some of the animal areas to see who can get the most kudo cards. We've got other shelters we've worked with who have picked like a staff member of the week and said, you are doing an extra good job working with volunteers. You get an extra 15 minutes or an extra 30 minutes on your lunch break this week. Or we have a preferred parking space and you get that parking space for this week or for this month. So there are ways that you can encourage your staff to do this. If you just tell people to do it, but there's nothing to indicate that you're paying attention to whether or not it's actually happening, it's not going to happen because we all have so many demands on our time every day. We can't focus on everything. We're going to focus on the ones that we know our leaders are paying attention to. That is just a matter of our own personal survival. That kind of leads into this next section here. Again, this is looking at how do you make this volunteer engagement an obvious and important part of your culture. Another thing you do is you make sure that it is clear that it's an expectation for all staff positions, all staff persons to be engaging volunteers, not just the volunteer coordinator. So how do you do that? Well, you add it to job descriptions. Okay, this shouldn't be one of those, oh yeah, by the way, on top of everything else we're asking you to do, now we want you to effectively engage volunteers. It shouldn't be a surprise or a gotcha. It needs to be in job descriptions right from the get-go so people understand that's an expectation. And in order to let people know this as early as possible, let's even talk about it in job interviews. One of the things we want to look for, how many of you have the t-shirt at home that says, I hate people, I only love cats? Anyone? Okay. A lot of times people who work with animals, what's that for dogs? Is that what someone said? Yeah, I'd have the dog version of that shirt too. So I'm more of a dog person. But a lot of times people who work with animals move in that direction because they're not so great with people. But the reality is working in animal welfare has to involve people. Our goal is to get animals into homes with people. Right? If the animals come to us not already attached to a person, we want to attach them to a person. So that means we need some people skills in order to be truly successful in animal welfare. So let's talk about that during job interviews. And specifically, let's talk about people skills as they relate to volunteers. Have you been a volunteer? Have you ever managed volunteers? What are your experiences like in terms of being or working with volunteers? Talk about that right up front. And then again, it's only important if someone's paying attention to it. If it's in your job description, it should be part of your performance evaluation, right? It's one of the things that we're looking at. If we tell you it's important and then we never bring it up again and there's no accountability, again, it's going to move way down your list because there are so many other things that you are being held accountable for. Okay. If you're starting to be resistant right now, if you're sitting there going, oh, great, one more thing I'm going to be accountable for, hold on. Don't get too defensive yet. I totally get it. I've been in your seat. But we're going to talk about the benefits of all this as we go along. So breathe deeply. Don't get too defensive yet. We also want to do the following things to make this part of our culture. We need to make sure that if we are asking staff to make volunteers an important part of their workday, then we need to give them time and opportunities to do things like meet with the volunteer coordinator so they can talk about ideas they have, or they can talk about maybe volunteer positions, new positions they have ideas about, or they can talk about concerns or issues that they're having with volunteers. Okay, make sure they've got time to do that. We want them to have time to help write position descriptions for those new volunteer position ideas. We want them to have time to work on volunteer training. One of the things that I see happen that always makes me cringe is in a lot of shelters, a new volunteer shows up and the volunteer coordinator greets them, takes them by the hand, walks them to the kennel area, goes up to a poor unsuspecting staff member and says, hi, this is Joe. He's a new volunteer. Can you train him, please? Have a good day. Bye. And the staff person is blindsided by this, right? They have all these other things they're supposed to get done, and suddenly they have a volunteer being dumped on them. And I do use the word dumped because that's what's happening in this situation. Heather, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay, just checking. I saw you approach the computer, so I was just checking. The other thing that happens is that the volunteer coordinator does the training of the new volunteers, but they're teaching them things incorrectly, or they're not teaching them the things that the volunteer really needs to be of actual service and assistance to the staff. So the staff needs to be part of at least helping to create that volunteer training, if not actually presenting that volunteer training. And they need to have time to do that. We also need to make sure that you are given time and training to learn how to be more effective with volunteers, how to give feedback, how to deal with conflict, how to do effective trainings, how to talk to your volunteers about euthanasia, how to talk to your volunteers about being less judgmental toward the public that comes into the shelter. These are all things that will make it easier for you to engage volunteers, but we can't expect you to just somehow magically have these skills and know how to do these things. Oh, let me go back for a second. So here's the deal. Before I came to work for Best Friends, I was a teacher for 29 years, and my last 4 years I was working at a middle school. Had a lot of challenges, um, low income, second language, blah, blah, blah. And we realized that we needed to make some really big changes to how we were doing things. And one of the things that we decided we needed was the opportunity for teachers to actually talk to each other, right? So that we could share ideas and we could talk about concerns regarding specific students and make sure that we were all working consistently toward the same goals. And there really was no time during the day for us to do this. We were busy teaching, right? There was no time to do this. So we started brainstorming, like, how could we make this happen? And what we came up with was that 4 days a week we would extend the number of minutes in the school day, and then 1 day a week, the kids would go home early, they would have a minimum day, and we would have time that we could meet together as teachers and staff and talk about these issues. Now, this was not an easy thing to arrange. We had to get permission from the school board. We had to get buy-in from parents. You know, for the parents, it could be a transportation issue. It could be a childcare issue. So we had to get their approval on this, and we had to get the darn school bus schedule to work around this new weekly schedule. So it wasn't easy, but we managed to do it. By thinking outside the box, we were able to carve out some time where we could have that critical communication opportunity. Now, obviously, you can't send all the animals home early 1 day a week so that you can all sit and talk and brainstorm with the volunteer coordinator. So I'm not recommending you try that approach, but what I want to tell you there is that if you sit down and try to think of some ways that you can carve out a little bit of time to do this training for yourselves, to work on position descriptions, to talk with your volunteer coordinator, so that it's not one more thing you have to do on top of an already overcrowded day, but that you actually have some time carved out and designated just for that. That is worth the effort to try to figure out how to do. Another thing to make volunteers part of your culture is to talk about the impact of the volunteers all the time, not just once a year during National Volunteer Appreciation Week, right? But constantly that you are sharing and hearing about what your volunteers are accomplishing. So you're sharing this information internally with the staff. You're also sharing it externally with your board, with the community, with the volunteers themselves. You can add it to board reports. Talk about what the volunteers are up to and what they're accomplishing. You can put it in that weekly email that goes out to staff or talk about it in staff meetings. You can put it in newsletters. You can put it on your social media. You can put it on your website. And when I say it, when we talk about volunteer impact, whenever I ask a shelter, how do you measure volunteer impact? The first answer always is hours. We track how many hours our volunteers are working. And hours are great, but really, hours in and of themselves don't have any value. Imagine for a moment that you had a million $1 bills but they were locked up in a room. Those $1 million bills would really be of little value to you if you couldn't use them to buy something. Okay, it's the same thing with hours. You can talk about having lots and lots of hours, but the hours in and of themselves don't have value. What are your volunteers doing with those hours? Are they walking 132 dogs a day? Are they doing 57 loads of laundry? Are they stuffing 98 Kongs? Are they returning 112 phone calls? So what is the actual impact of the time that they're donating? What are they accomplishing for you? What are they taking off your plate? All right, so that's the first section, making volunteer engagement part of your culture. Any questions or comments before we go on to our next section? This is the part where I give you think time and I get to have a sip of my tea. Nothing yet. All right, let's move on. Has anybody been part of organizational change that looked kind of like this? Unfortunately, I have found myself on that bottom row more times than I care to think about. A lot of times when change is implemented, someone up at the top who has no freaking idea what our daily lives are like, they're the ones saying, hey, I've got this great idea for change, right? And then those of us who actually have to implement it, we're the ones who suffer the consequences. I know there have been many times that I've been part of a change where I was like, I wish they had talked to me before they decided to do this, because I would have told them why it won't work, or I would have told them how to tweak this so it will work. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. And one of the things that I see over and over again is that a shelter's volunteer program is something that happens to the staff rather than with the staff. The volunteer program does not belong to the volunteer coordinator. It does not belong to the volunteers. It does not belong to your executive director. The volunteer program belongs to everybody on your staff. And you all need to be part of figuring out how to build that program so it works for all of you. I always like to look at it in terms of this. I love analogies, and I like to think of it in terms of this input-output machine. Let's think about this in terms of Las Vegas for a moment. Imagine this input-output machine is a slot machine. And every time you input a dollar, your output is either going to be 50 cents or $5. So you know the rules going in. So you put in a dollar and you get out 50 cents. And you put in a dollar and you get out 50 cents. And you put in a dollar and you get out 50 cents. And you do this multiple times and you keep getting 50 cents out as your payout. How likely are you to keep putting a dollar in? Not very likely, right? Whereas, what if you put in a dollar and you get $5 out? Over and over and over again, you keep putting in a dollar and getting $5 out. Now, how likely are you to keep putting a dollar into that slot machine? Pretty darn likely, because you're getting something of greater value out. What we see happening a lot with staff and volunteer programs is that they're not putting a dollar in, but they're putting in time and they're putting in effort and they're putting in energy. Because if someone tries to tell you that working with volunteers does not require time, effort, and energy, unfortunately, they're lying to you. The truth is they do require time, effort, and energy. But the crux is, what's your output, right? Was it worth it for you to put in that time, effort, and energy? Just like with the gambling analogy, If you're putting in $1 and only getting 50 cents out over and over again, of course you're going to be resistant to continuing that, right? If you keep putting in time, effort, and energy, and you get volunteers that don't follow the rules, that don't know what to do, that continue to be a time suck, that show up twice and then disappear, you're not going to be very motivated to continuing to put in that time, effort, and energy. That's not because you have a bad attitude. That's because you're smart and you realize there's not a payoff for you in this. But that doesn't mean that volunteers suck. What that means is that you need to take a look at why it's not working and make some changes. Okay? You need to look at your program, how it's set up, your processes, and your procedures, right? Unlike that slot machine where you can't affect any changes and make it always give you $5 as a payout, you can do that with a volunteer program. You can look at what's not working and change it so that your output is almost always greater than your input. I can't guarantee you 100%, but almost always. It's doable. And in order to make that happen, you need to get past that situation that I mentioned before, where the staff has no influence over the volunteer program. Okay. You need to be involved in that volunteer program in order to help create a system that is going to give you bang for your buck. Staff needs to be involved in deciding what kind of volunteer positions are needed. You know what you need, right? You know it way better than maybe the volunteer coordinator or the senior manager, okay? You need to know what those positions are going to entail. Let's say you're the foster coordinator and you decide that you really need some foster assistance to help you do your job, okay? Who better than you to be able to list what those foster assistants would do in that role? Okay, makes the most sense that you would be the one to basically design this position and say what you need those volunteers to do. As we mentioned before, you are also the best person to figure out what kind of training that new volunteer would need for that position and maybe what sort of skills they need to have coming in. If you want someone to help follow up and make phone calls to potential fosters, you want someone who has good basic phone manners, right? If you want someone to input data, you need someone who already has good basic computer skills. Have you ever seen, this is a classic, the volunteer who goes like to the community event and they're going to work at your community table at this event and they turn out to be like the shyest person on the planet? And all they do is sit way in the back and like play on their phone. You're like, why are you here? A basic skill that the volunteer should have had for that position was that they're outgoing, they like to talk to people, they're friendly, they have good customer service skills. So you need to be the one to say, I need volunteers in this position to have these basic skills, and here's what they need to be trained on in order to actually be effective help for me. You know when the volunteers are needed, okay? If you have a volunteer position for people to help clean kennels, I would imagine that first thing in the morning would be a critical time for you to get those volunteers in. So think about, is there a time that you most need the volunteers and how many are needed? If we go back to that foster assistant position, you may need 4 volunteers to help you with the things that you need to get done. If you have 14 or 40 in that position, now you're being stressed with trying to come up with work for them to do. Remember, the point here is not to make more work for you, but to bring in volunteers that can help you with your workload, right? So setting a limit on how many volunteers you need to do a certain position is also part of the information that you need to share in creating this role. You've all heard of like the elephant in the living room. This is the elephant in the animal shelter. If we ignore the elephant in the animal shelter, our credibility plummets. And the elephant in the animal shelter, in this case, are the concerns that staff has about working with volunteers. If we pretend that those concerns don't exist, our credibility plummets. Okay. And I've seen volunteer coordinators and senior managers, directors act like whenever the staff brings up a concern, they're just being whiny and complaining. And that is not the case. Because what's interesting is that no matter where I go, when I talk with staff about what their concerns are, I hear the same thing, the same challenges, the same issues over and over and over again. And I'm sure there's not some secret underground communication tunnel where y'all are getting together and making this stuff up and agreeing on it, right? The reason why I hear the same things over and over again is because they're real. They are real concerns and they are valid. So it's important that you are asked to share those concerns because they are valid. And the only way to try to resolve some of those concerns is if they're voiced and they're shared, and then you can start trying to problem solve. One of the things that's always at the top of the list is, I don't have enough time to deal with volunteers. It is absolutely valid. Absolutely. That's why I talked before about trying to figure out a way to carve out some time to work on volunteer issues. Okay. It can also be addressed by revamping your onboarding process for new volunteers, by changing your training processes. There are things you can do so that your program is changed and your time is not wasted working with volunteers, right? That you're getting that bang for your buck. We also hear that the volunteers don't have the skills or the training. We talked about that a little bit already, okay? Be clear what you need in terms of skills and what sort of training a volunteer is going to need in order to be effective in their job. We hear that volunteers don't follow the rules. Okay, that's not all right. It creates a headache for you. It creates challenges for you. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, we want to make sure that they know what the rules are. I call them a lot of times the shoulda knowns, like, oh, well, you should have known that you can't go in this room back here, or you can't walk that dog that's got this sign up or whatever. We have to make sure that we're sharing the rules with them, and we have to hold our volunteers accountable for following those rules. It's not okay for volunteers to continually be breaking rules. Luckily, that's the exception. Most people want to do a good job. Okay, they don't go to the trouble of signing up to be a volunteer just to be a pain in your you know what. Okay, they want to do a good job, but we need to make sure they know the rules. Have you had volunteers who challenge your authority on things? Has that been an issue for any of you?
Yes.
Yes, no's. It's not okay for volunteers to get in your face. It's okay for them to ask questions, but they need to know the right time, the right place, the right person, and the right way to do that. Okay? We need to make sure they know those things, and then we need to hold them accountable for doing that. We need to be clear about that up front, and they need to be reminded of that along the way. Do you have problems with your volunteers gossiping?
Yes.
Yes. Again, I think everybody does. We've got that too. Um, Again, we need to be clear up front with our volunteers. A lot of times having a code of conduct is really helpful in clarifying what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And if people break these rules, if they don't follow the code of conduct, they do need to be held responsible for that. I I know we've all been in a situation, maybe even with our own children, but I see this out in public all the time. You hear, Johnny, stop it. Johnny, I mean it. Johnny, don't make me get up. Johnny, don't make me come over there. Johnny, I'm serious, right? And it's like, shut up, less talk, more action, right? So if we've got these rules, if we have these codes of conduct for our volunteers, we need to hold them responsible for that. We need to say, okay, you broke this rule. Here's a reminder of what the rule is. Oh, you broke it again. We're going to have a serious talk now, and we're going to discuss how if this happens a third time, you're gone. And then if it happens a third time, you say, thank you for your service with us, but you're being terminated as a volunteer. Or something similar, some sort of similar escalation of consequences for people who aren't following the rules. We at the sanctuary just had to terminate a local volunteer a couple weeks ago. It doesn't happen very often because we have systems in place to try to redirect people back and so they're moving the right direction, but it has to be there. If you've got the volunteer that's constantly causing problems, you have to be able um, to save the sanity of everybody else on the team by getting rid of that person who's causing the problems. A lot of times, especially if they're not following rules, you've got volunteers that are creating safety issues for themselves, for members of the community, for the animals themselves. It's important, again, if you've got critical safety issues, that may be something where if the person's been reminded and they blow it again, you're like, no, I'm sorry, you're done. Maybe we don't terminate you from being a volunteer for the whole organization, but maybe you can't be in this particular volunteer role anymore. Okay. You can't work with dogs anymore because you're determined to get your face bitten off. But we can use you over here as a foster assistant or helping at the front desk or doing something else. We hear over and over again that volunteers aren't committed and reliable. Sometimes that's true. There are people whose natures are not to be committed and reliable. But oftentimes, when volunteers don't show up or don't come back, again, there are problems with our volunteer program that are resulting in that behavior, right? If I volunteered in San Diego before I moved out here to Kanab, and I would go faithfully to volunteer at this shelter, and I would walk in the door and I would walk past the front desk staff who never looked up and never said anything to me. And then I would walk down the back hallway to the volunteer office where I would practically bump into staff people walking down this hallway and passing them, and no one ever looked up. No one said hello. No one smiled. No one made eye contact. I would sign in, put on my little badge, go to help in the dog area. And literally, if I had a question about something, I was terrified about who to ask because I knew that when I did, the most common response I would get would be an eye roll from the staff person. And what's really crazy and indicative of my degree of masochism is that I kept coming back to that situation, right? I was really determined to try to make this work somehow. Most people, though, are going to be a little more sane than I was, and they're going to say, I hate coming here. I feel miserable, uncomfortable, unwelcome, unvalued, and I'm done. I'm not coming back. So there are reasons why volunteers might not be coming back. And yeah, it creates a huge drain on your sanity and your time and energy when you're training volunteers only to have them disappear. So you need to look at, again, at the program and figure out, why are these volunteers not coming back? And sometimes I get this concern, sometimes I don't. It really kind of depends on the shelter. Sometimes staff is concerned that volunteers are going to take their jobs. You know, they're like, well, if I train this volunteer to do my job, they'll get rid of me to save money and have the volunteer do it instead. It is actually exceedingly rare that I've ever seen leadership take this approach. Um, there are things that paid staff can do that volunteers cannot do. And so we are always going to need paid staff. So if this is a concern, I think it's something valid for you to ask about, but it's more, this is the one that I think is more not real than real, because it really doesn't happen hardly ever. The frustration of volunteers that don't follow procedures and don't follow the rules is a very real frustration. One of the things that you have to do in order to alleviate that frustration and minimize that rule breaking is to make sure that everybody's on the same page. One of the things that you can do for this is, and I don't mean you, this would be something that your volunteer coordinator would probably do with your input, is make sure you have a comprehensive volunteer handbook. I mentioned earlier talking about code of conduct. I talked about the grounds for terminating a volunteer. Those are important things to have in that handbook so that the volunteers know that up front, so that they know who do they go to when they have a question or concern. What is appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to how they interact with staff or interact with the public. Those things can be spelled out in the volunteer handbook. We've talked about creating those volunteer position descriptions that are very clear about what a volunteer is going to do in that role versus what they're not going to do, right? That's very clear about what sort of skills they need to bring to the table and what sort of training they're going to need. And this is a big one. I think in all of animal welfare, you know, there's always a lot of turnover, and the basic onboarding plan for new staff is something similar to sink or swim. Is that true where you're at too? Like, hi, you're the new XYZ staff person. Welcome. Get to work, right? Watch so-and-so over there. They'll show you what to do. And that's sort of survival, right? Everyone's overwhelmed. But what you end up with a lot of times is that staff isn't even in agreement about how to do certain things. So I come in as a new volunteer and I train with Bob on my first day. And Bob says, this is how we do this job. Boom, 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 boom. And I pay really close attention because I really want to do well. And the next time I come to volunteer, it's Bob's day off, and the key staff person who's there is Sue. And so I'm working and I'm trying really hard to follow all the rules that Bob told me about. And Sue looks at me and says, what on earth are you doing? And I'm like, I'm cleaning the kitty condo. And she's like, that's not how we do it. The problem isn't me. It's not that I'm not following rules. The problem is that Bob and Sue have two very different ways that they approach the cleaning of kitty condos. They're not even in agreement. So Sue's thinking, here's another pain in the butt volunteer who can't follow the rules. Well, I am following the rules, though, the rules that Bob taught me. Okay, so sometimes when you start looking at this and looking at why volunteers aren't doing things the right way, you find that as you're peeling the layers back on that onion, the real problem is that your staff isn't even in agreement about what the right way is to do something. So y'all need to figure that out first, and then you'll know how to train your volunteers. When it comes to training, I talked about the conflict between Bob training me and then Sue's expectations. It's really important that you try to have consistency in your training. That's why it's so much better to have a formalized training program versus dumping a new volunteer on someone and just expecting them to try to fit the training in around everything else that they're doing that day. Okay, you want to make sure that if I'm a volunteer in this particular role, I am going to get trained and given the same information no matter who gives me that training. That is going to save a lot of frustration for the volunteer, which means they'll be more likely to come back and be committed and reliable. And it's going to save a lot of frustration for you because there'll be less times that you're needing to correct people because they're doing it wrong. The other thing, I mentioned before, the vast majority of people who come to volunteer, they really want to be helpful. They really do. And a lot of times when they come for training, we dump a massive amount of information in their brains, and we expect them to somehow remember all of it. Okay? That can be really unrealistic given the amount of information we often give them. And so I'm a big believer in what I call job aids, right? We're going to give people this information, but we're also going to give them resources to go back to help them remember the right way to do things. And that might be a manual, it might be a checklist. Like if I'm cleaning the dog kennels, if I'm answering the phones at the front desk, if I'm responding to emails, here's a checklist of the things that I need to make sure that I do. Signage, I think, is really helpful. I worked with a shelter where the people who worked in the cat rooms were really, really rigid about how those kitty condos should look after they've been cleaned, right? And I totally get the importance of proper cleaning, but I mean, it was like, all right, after you clean it, the litter box goes here, and then in front of that goes the water bowl and then the food bowl, not the other way around. Food bowl needs to be closest to the front of the kitty condo. And then over here you have the blankie, and then you have 3 toys that are lined up parallel at a 45-degree angle, right? Like it needs to look exactly like this. And the poor staff in the cat building and the cat rooms were crazed because the volunteers weren't setting up the condos exactly the way they liked. So we came up with the idea of, okay, you set up the perfect kitty condo. Let's take some pictures of what it looks like. And then we're going to put those pictures and we're going to put a list, a checklist. Do this, do this, do this. This goes here, this goes here, this goes here. We printed it up, we laminated it, and we stuck several of them up in the cat rooms so that the volunteers had something to refer back to. Now, I think some of their demands were a little crazy, like the parallel cat toys. I'm only exaggerating a little about that. But the point is, we came up with a job aid to help the volunteers be successful, and that minimized the frustration of the staff because they didn't feel like they were having to either remind volunteers or go back and redo the job themselves afterwards, which is what they were currently doing. Another thing that's really huge, not only in terms of saving you time, but also in terms of improving retention so that new volunteers keep coming back, is using volunteer mentors to support new volunteers, right? After we dump all this information into their head, they go home and then they come back the next time, say, to volunteer, and they're really, really trying to remember everything. And they can't even remember, do I turn left or right down this hallway to get to the bathroom, right? So if you can have mentor experienced volunteers who can work with new volunteers the first time or the first couple of times that they come in. That's going to relieve you from having to answer all those questions, and it's going to make the new volunteer feel more comfortable and more supported. When we talk about volunteer mentors, it's important, a lot of times we're like, oh, well, Elizabeth has been volunteering here for 6 years. She knows a lot. She'd be a great mentor. Well, maybe or maybe not. Elizabeth may know a lot, but she also might be the volunteer that gets in your face and challenges you. Remember, when someone's a mentor, they're going to be creating a bunch of mini-me's. You may not want a bunch of little Elizabeths running around. Okay? And I know you guys are already thinking in your minds of the volunteers that fit that description. So when you're choosing volunteers to be mentors, it's not just about their skills and it's not just about what they know about the role. It's also, are they a team player? Are they a good communicator? Are they respectful? Do they model all of the other human behaviors that we want our new volunteers to have? So it's important to think about that when selecting volunteer mentors. As you're working with volunteers, when you come across volunteers that you're like, wow, this person learns really fast, they follow the rules, they're pleasant to work with, be thinking, gosh, this person might potentially be a good mentor volunteer. Let your volunteer coordinator know that. Okay. The other thing to consider is creating what's called a tiered volunteer program. And we see this a lot especially like in dog volunteer roles. There is so much to learn really about coming in and working with dogs. If there's a situation where your volunteer training for something is 2 or 3 hours long, that's too much information, right? No one's going to retain that much information. You're better off dividing that into smaller, shorter trainings and creating separate levels of positions for that. So if I'm a brand new volunteer, I go to level 1 training, and then I'm allowed to do tasks A, B, and C. These are easier tasks, lower risk, stuff that does not require a huge amount of prior knowledge and information. After I've put in a certain amount of time in that role and the staff says, yes, she is sane and competent, then I can go to the level 2 training. And when I complete that, now I can still do tasks A, B, and C, but I can also do D, E, and F. More responsibility, more risk involved. I may be working with bigger dogs or dogs that are a little bit more behaviorally challenging, or I can have more independence to take dogs for outside walks or whatever would be appropriate for your system. And if I put in X number of more hours and the staff says, yes, she is still sane, she's still a good problem solver, she is someone we would recommend, then I could go to level 3 training. And then I could take on even more responsibility and even more demanding tasks. This is a good way to give out information and training in manageable chunks, and to make sure that only the people with the most training who have demonstrated a commitment to the role, who've put in their time, and who you have approved are the ones working in the higher risk, more challenging sort of situations. I think that especially when it comes to direct animal care, it's really stressful to turn a bunch of strangers into the kennels with your animals. right? Because you know the potential for problems. So what can you do to try to make sure things are as safe and sane as possible? And a tiered volunteer program is one way to do that. Another issue is that, staff is told, hey, you're supposed to supervise volunteers or you're supposed to be engaging volunteers. And it's like, well, what does that look like exactly? And in a lot of ways, they're almost asking you to kind of be a manager, right? We're saying, hey, we want you to be able to delegate certain tasks to the volunteers, and we want you to give them feedback on how they're doing, and we want you to resolve minor conflicts, and we want you to help build teams so everybody learns how to work together. And we want you to motivate these volunteers so they feel good and they want to come back. And we want you to help them build their skills. And we want you to keep an eye out for people who have leadership potential. These are all things that managers do, at least if they're good managers, right? And being a manager is not easy. I mean, if you go on Amazon and you search for books on how to be a good manager, there are thousands of them. And this proves that being a manager is not easy. There's a lot to learn about effectively managing people. And yet, oftentimes, we take that 19-year-old direct animal care employee and we say, here's a bunch of volunteers. We want you to manage or engage these volunteers, supervise these volunteers. And a lot of times what that means is you have a 19-year-old animal care staff person trying to tell a 54-year-old professional woman how to do things and how not to do things, right? It is not reasonable to expect that people have these skills, right? And to ask them to do things that they have not been trained how to do. So what do we do about that? Well, we want to make sure that staff has what they need in order to provide this sort of supervision, this sort of direction and engagement. So that means, and I mentioned this earlier, we need to give you the training on how to do that, right? Like, what's the best way to give feedback? How do we resolve conflict? How do we talk with our volunteers about difficult topics like euthanasia? Euthanasia is a huge hot button issue. Have you had that come up as a area of conflict with your volunteers?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think especially the as the save rate increases and the incidents of euthanasia become fewer, each one now seems to have so much more emotion attached to it. I think it's actually made things a little more challenging in terms of trying to get volunteers to understand why this might be happening, because it's not happening all the time. So if there's a drawback to increasing your life-saving rate, that might be it, if that makes any sense. But I hear this from a lot of shelters. The less often they're doing euthanasias, the more emotional intensity it seems to bring to each one that they do have to do. So are you getting training on how to discuss these sorts of issues? We need to make sure that you get that training. And when you actually step up and supervise, do you have backup for that? I hate it when it becomes one of those situations where you expect a volunteer to follow the rules, you tell them what the rules are, and then they run to somebody else higher up the food chain, and that person says, oh, no, you're okay. You do whatever you want, right? It's like when mom says, no, go ask dad, playing out right there in the shelter. It's not going to make you feel very good about supervising when your authority is being undercut like that. Or if you're providing direction and then someone comes back to you later and tells you you shouldn't have done that, right? So we want to make sure if we're asking you to supervise and manage and engage these volunteers, we need to have your back when you're actually doing that. We need to support you. And I think it's important that staff, it's a reasonable expectation that staff will handle low-level issues, right? I worked with a shelter once where there was a volunteer who repeatedly used the wrong cat litter for this cat that had allergies, right? This cat had allergies, so they had to use this special dust-free litter. And whenever this volunteer came in, she would forget that and put the regular litter in. And this went on for months. And after the, it was like she'd come in, she'd do this, she'd leave, the staff would dump out the wrong litter, put in the right litter, and never said a word to this woman that she was using the wrong litter. And the staff frustration built and built and built. They were like, oh God, here she comes again. We're going to have to redo her work. No, you could just tell her, right? You could just tell her this is a low-level situation that you as a staff person can resolve pretty quickly and easily. So 90% of the stuff that comes up is low level like that, and stuff that you can handle if you've been given the training and you've got the support to do that. But there's also situations that are more serious, either something that's really egregious right from the get-go, or a volunteer that has been given reminders, support, redirection, and still continues to not do things the right way. And you need to know there needs to be a process in place for how to handle those situations. You need to know what that process is, and you need to know that that process is going to be followed, right? You don't want a situation where everybody is complaining about the same volunteer for weeks and weeks and months, or even years and years, God forbid, and nothing's ever really happening, right? So there needs to be a process, and that process needs to be followed. Otherwise, it's like you're banging your heads against a wall. It's really frustrating, and you don't need that extra frustration. Have you had that situation?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, that it's like there's these, it comes up and it's like, this person's really driving us all crazy, but she's also a high donor. So we have to keep her around. So it can be tricky sometimes. But I think if we're not doing something about these volunteers that are making life miserable for everybody else, it's like it's an unfair situation to put everybody else in. You have to do something so that it doesn't taint the well for everybody else. And finally, it's really important that if you want your staff to treat volunteers well, then you better be treating your staff well, because otherwise you have nothing left in your cup to share with volunteers. So staff needs to be treated with respect if we want the staff to treat the volunteers with respect. Staff needs to be shown on a regular basis that they are valued. They need to be listened to when they have concerns and questions and ideas. Your staff, you guys need to feel welcome. Do people greet you in the morning when you come in, right? Do they notice if you're gone? Do they ask you, oh, were you sick? Are you feeling better? Or what's going on with your puppy? Does your puppy still have giardia, heaven forbid? You know, like, are you made to feel welcome and part of the team? If that's not part of the culture of your organization, it's going to be hard to make volunteers feel that way because you're not getting it. Are you being given effective feedback? Or do you only know how you're doing once a year when you sit down with your manager for your performance evaluation, right? It's going to be easier for you to know how to give feedback if you're getting it and it's being modeled for you. Are you being recognized for doing a good job, right? Like we want staff to tell volunteers thank you and hey, you did a great job reorganizing the supplies in the supply room or whatever. But are you getting that same sort of reinforcement and recognition? Is your cup being filled? All right, a few last thoughts. First of all, working with volunteers involves a certain amount of delayed gratification, right? They come to us, most of the time, they don't know a whole lot about what we want them to do, and we need to invest in them up front and then hopefully get the payoff a little further down the line. Now, guess what? As a culture, we are not good with delayed gratification. The proof of that is in your credit card statement, right? We want what we want when we want it. We don't want to have to wait for the good stuff, right? We all have the credit card bills to prove that. But we have to sort of re-engage our brains and remember that we're going to have to invest up front to get something out. Going back to that input-output machine, if what you're getting out is not of greater value than what you're putting in, it's a sign of sanity if you're resistant. That's sanity, folks. Doesn't mean you're not a team player, doesn't mean you have a bad attitude. It means you're sane. But we need to look at then how can we change our system, our process, our procedures, so our payoff, so the gratification we get may still be delayed, but we're actually getting gratification at the end of that. If you've been in a situation where working with volunteers has really sucked for a long time, you're not going to change your mental attitude about that overnight, right? The more of a struggle it's been for you, the longer it's going to take for you to go, oh, I get it. Volunteers really can be helpful. They really can help me do my job. Okay. You need to understand that, and the volunteer coordinator needs to understand that, and leadership needs to understand. The tougher the situation has been, the longer it's going to take to sort of switch over sort of that whole tone of how you feel about volunteers. And if you're one of the people that is, the early adopter, the one who's like, I love change, I love new ideas, I love trying new things, you're the one who really needs to step up or you need to find that person. If you're in leadership positions already, you need to find those people on your team who are willing to try something new and bring them on as your partner, right? If you've got 10 people that you're talking to about, hey, I want to start working with staff to write position descriptions, and 9 of the people roll their eyes and one of them says, I think that's a great idea. That's the person you want to start working with, right? Low-hanging fruit. And then as you start getting those success stories, as you start seeing the gratification and seeing that beneficial output, that's where we want to start shining a light on that and using that as examples. Like, hey, this isn't just Heather over here talking or Chris talking about how great volunteers are. Here's an example of how our foster coordinator brought on some foster assistant volunteers, and now those volunteers are putting together all of the foster supply bags. They're scheduling the vaccination check-ins. They're returning calls from people who are saying they might be interested in fostering. And it's saving our foster coordinator X number of hours every week by having volunteers who are doing that. Shine a light on that, because it's going to help people who are resistant to the idea start thinking, maybe I'd like some of this help too. Maybe this would work for me. Because this is actually, what I'm seeing here is that volunteers are actually being beneficial. And that's what I want. I'm seeing that they're being beneficial. The other thing, a lot of times when staff is asked, well, do you need volunteers? Is there some sort of new volunteer role that you'd like to have us develop? I think our go-to response to that is no, I'm fine, because our brains are so overwhelmed we can't even go there, right? So we're like, no, 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 I know, I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't need any volunteers. And so we need to kind of keep our eyes open for opportunities. And they might not come labeled as opportunities. They might sound a little more like a whine. Oh my God, I can't believe I need to have this done by next week. Or it might sound a little more like a complaint, like, oh geez, now they've added this to my plate. One more thing I've got to get done. When you're whining or complaining, or you're hearing whines and complaints, what that's telling you is that there's potential for bringing in a volunteer to help you do those things. Okay, so learn to look at those as opportunities for yourself and also for other people, right? As you see this going on around you, say, hey, is there a way a volunteer could help you with this? Another thing I think that's really important is to start building those relationships between staff and volunteers. Again, so it's not a us versus them situation, but it's all of us as a team. We are all working toward our shelter's mission and our goals for the year, right? We're all doing this together. One of the shelters we worked with, Asheville, North Carolina, Humane Society, they do a game night once a month, and they play. Staff and volunteers come together. They meet in the community room at their shelter. Some people bring snacks or food, and they play games together. Other shelters will have a happy hour, or they'll have a pizza night. And it's not like, oh, this is a volunteer appreciation pizza party, and yeah, staff, you can come if you want to. It's literally planned for staff and volunteers to do together. It's a great way for people to get to know each other outside of the immediate demands of their work. If there's a training going on, let's say you're doing a training on canine body language, don't just do that for staff, open that up for volunteers to come too. It's an opportunity for you to be together, to get the same information at the same time. So there's that consistency. And it starts to treat everybody as the same team, not separate. Now, please don't misunderstand. Do I think you should be able to get together on a Friday night, just staff, go out, have a couple beers, and bitch and moan and complain? Absolutely. You must be able to do this. You do not, it is counterproductive to think that you are always going to have a volunteer in your midst, so you're having to kind of guard what you're saying. You need times to yourself to just decompress. So that is not what I'm saying. Don't mishear me, because you'll hate me if you think that's what I'm saying. But what I am saying is it's great to have opportunities where you guys can socialize or train or do things together as one team. Not always, but sometimes. And last but not least, if something's not working, talk to the people who are involved to find out why. Nobody is a mind reader. And yet we tend to do this, right? Like, oh, my significant other seems distant, or somebody just unfriended me on Facebook, or my friend hasn't called me in 2 weeks, and that's totally not like her. And we drive ourselves crazy trying to guess why these things are happening. That's not an effective way to get an answer, right? The effective way is to talk to the people directly. So if you have volunteers who show up a couple times and never come back, it's really important that someone talks to them and says, where's the breakdown? Right? Because we've all identified volunteers that come and then disappear. It's a drain on your time and your energy and your sanity. So talk to the volunteers, find out what the problem is so that it can be addressed. Staff needs to talk to leadership and volunteer coordinators about their concerns, what's working, what's not working, right? Don't make anyone try to be a mind reader because it will not be effective. All right, so talked about a lot of stuff. Now you just need to go make it happen. I'll give you to the end of the week. How's that sound? I am going to be sharing with Heather and Marissa a collection of resources. It's got some volunteer surveys in there. I talked about, getting info from volunteers, questions for staff so that you guys can start giving some input, some links to some videos, staff training topics, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read the whole list to you. And there's a link on here, but I'll be sharing the link with them. And the most important thing, I think, is that you guys really keep those communication channels open so that you're all working toward a common goal. If something's not working, talk to the people involved in that and figure out what needs to change. Do you guys have any questions?
I'm like, where's the ice cream?
Where's the ice cream?
Ice cream? Heather, did you promise them ice cream?
She just did.
Actually, an ice cream social is a great event to do for staff and volunteers. Everybody loves ice cream, and so bringing everybody together for an ice cream social and make your own Sunday kind of thing is a great opportunity to do that. But Heather, if you would like to just give everyone in that room ice cream, I'm sure there would be no complaints about that.
None.
You guys really want ice cream?
Oh. 365 days a year.
They're ready. It takes cold to make ice cream, right?
Sam, I haven't we haven't enough budget.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very informative.
All right, thanks you guys. And Heather knows this and Marissa knows this. If you ever have questions about any of this stuff, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can talk to Heather or Marissa, and then they can always reach out to us. We are here to help. So please be in touch if you've got questions. All right. Thanks so much for your time and attention this morning. What time is it? Oh, I'm giving you a few extra minutes back in your day. Go get your ice cream and keep up the good work. You guys are all doing amazing things.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.